Good evening. Welcome to tonight's talk by James Young and to our year-long series on memorials and commemoration in the U.S. Tonight's program will start with a short video about the humanities at URI.
We are facing problems and challenges that do not have easy, simple, finite solutions. Machines are going to be doing so much stuff for us. The only things that are going to be left are the things that only human brains can do. And those kinds of things are taught by the arts and humanities.
Studying the humanities, studying literature, drama, art, performance, what that feeds in a student is possibility.
The University of Rhode Island is a really good place to pursue one's interests in an environment of opportunities. That engagement, in some way, shape, or form, becomes in part the definition of the university experience.
Every area of the humanities trains you to investigate, explore. If you want to lead, you have to have a broad, interdisciplinary, open-minded approach to the world.
Exploration is the foundation of everything that we do. You have to be able to think beyond the circumstances you're presently in. The critical thinking, the language skills, reasoning abilities, those are the ways that you can build a bridge between what you did before and what you can do in the future.
The skills students learn in the humanities are skills that they will take into every aspect of their future life, both personal and professional.
The problems that we have facing us are complicated issues that require people who move across disciplines, think creatively, think deeply. That's something that humanities provides. You're getting that methodology and the practice that'll prepare you for your future.
Good evening. I'm Eve Stern, Director of URI Center for the Humanities. I'm terribly sorry about the delay in getting started. We had some technical problems. I'd like to welcome you to the fourth event in our series on memorials and commemoration in the U.S. This year-long series of virtual and in-person events will discuss our collective decisions and dialogues about what to commemorate, the ideals we express, and whom we include. This evening, the Center is honored to present Professor James Young, who will be speaking about the stages of memory, reflections on memorial art, loss, and the spaces between. We will have questions and answers after the panel, so please type your questions into the chat at any time, and be sure to like and share the talk on social media. Now I'd like to welcome Dr. James Mace Ward, teaching professor in modern European history at URI, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, who is a preeminent scholar of memorialization. Among other academic posts, Professor Young is the Distinguished University Professor of English and Judaic Studies Emeritus and founding director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His Writing and Rewriting the Holocaust, The Texture of Memory, won the National Jewish Book Award in 1994, while his most recent book, The Stages of Memory, Reflections on Memorial Art, Loss, and the Spaces Between, won the National Council for Public History Book Award in 2017. Dr. Young has also served as a consultant or juror in design competitions for a number of important memorials, including Berlin's Holocaust Memorial and New York's World Trade Center Memorial. Given this fact, we should not be surprised that he is also the recipient of numerous prestigious awards and grants. In short, it is hard to think of a more experienced or trustworthy guide for this field. I'm certainly looking forward to learning much from his talk tonight, and please join me in welcoming to our virtual stage Professor James Young.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Eve, James, Leah, thanks for all your help and getting my slideshow up and running. It's a pleasure. I do wish I were there. So maybe next time, let's say next year. And I'll try to get to URI, do this in person. So I'm just going to reflect a little bit, as I did in the last book, on this what I would call a trajectory of memorial vernaculars, really from World War I through World War II and the Holocaust, up through 9/11, the Denkmal in Berlin, that is a memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, all the way to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, otherwise known as the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. And I'd like to begin with this question I had after we announced the winning design in January 2004 for the National 9/11 Memorial at Ground Zero in New York City. I was on the jury that chose this memorial designed by Peter O'Rod. I'm sorry, Michael O'Rod, of course, and Peter Walker. And this is a design that includes two huge recessed voids in the footprints of the World Trade Center towers, going down about 30 feet deep. And then at the centers of these voids, we have another void that you can't even see the bottom to, which would go all the way down to bedrock. So we have waterfalls going down the edges, surrounded by groves of white swamp oaks. The taller these trees grow, of course, the deeper the voids will become. We love this design because in reflecting absence, this memorial remembered both life with life, as in the growing trees and the fauna there, and the lives lost, and the voids left behind by lost lives, which were lost forever. I'm going to take a chance here just so you can see that. So the actual board we chose. And this is like a mock-up. Can everybody see this? I guess just want to check. Okay. So the first question I had from the press, we weren't allowed for the 9 months we deliberated, some 5,201 designs. We weren't allowed to talk about any of the process except after this January announcement in 2004. The first question I had from a journalist was somebody who'd done his research. He said, knowing that you've been on the jury for the Denkmal, knowing that you've been writing about voids and negative form monuments and anti-monuments and counter monuments in Germany, and that you chose the Peter Eisenman design in Berlin, the 2,711 Stelle at all different heights and ground levels. And that, so many of these negative form monuments actually were Holocaust monuments. Haven't you, as a jury, just chosen yet another Holocaust monument? And of course, I said, well, no, we haven't chosen another Holocaust monument. I find that, the question even a little bit offensive. But as I began to formulate an answer, I realized that the reporter did have a point. That if I went back and began to retrace this vernacular of voids, negative form monuments, it would go all the way back both to World War I, and then even I remember this conversation I had, of course, with Maya Lin, who was also on the jury. Maya Lin, of course, was the designer for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And Maya had told me at one point that her Vietnam Veterans Memorial was also inspired by one World War I memorial, the Edwin Lutyens Memorial for the Battle of the Somme, the missing of the Battle of the Somme, and a memorial to the deported Jews of Paris. They are on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. And she described, in fact, what it was like when she took her junior year abroad at Yale, the year before she entered the design competition with the rest of her class, Vince Scully's class, on monument design. Going down these narrow stairs in the Ile-de-la-Cité Memorial, designed by Henri Pinguichon in 1962. So it was a very early Holocaust memorial. And finding that this very narrow stairway kind of blocked out the sky. You can see just the Notre Dame Cathedral spire there in the background. And that this memorial had been carved out of the ground. That instead of coming face to face with a gigantic positive form, this memorial was actually born of recesses. If you look through this grated window right here, you would see across the riverside to the left bank. And if you're on the left bank looking at the memorial itself, you would see what looks like the prow of a ship in the river here. I actually described it. The Ministry of Defense described this memorial on its unveiling in these words: a place of contemplation and remembrance of the suffering caused by the deportation of 76,000 Jews, including 11,000 children. It was created by the architect Georges-Henri Pinguichon and depicts certain features that define the concentration camp environment: narrow passages, tight staircases, spiked gates, restricted views with no sight of the horizon, and frequent references to the triangle, the distinctive mark of the deportee. So imagine Maya Lin here, sitting in this space, coming back to New Haven the next year and entering the competition for a memorial to Vietnam, the veterans of the Vietnam War, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And what she wanted to do, and she had this question, in fact, how to articulate the memory of veterans who were called and fought in a war that the country had, eventually come to really abhor. And in her words, she said, she imagined taking a knife and cutting into the earth, opening it up, an initial violence and pain that in time would heal. That is, she opened a space in the landscape that she hoped would open a space within us for memory. She said, I never looked at the memorial as a wall, as an object, but as an edge to the earth, an opened side. So instead of a positive V form, like the jutting elbow or a spear tip, the very traditional, the most aggressive architectural and military form, the flying wedge is a military formation, the tip of an arrow, she opened up the V's obverse space. So if I were jutting my elbow out, I would then open that elbow and you would have that embrace, the embracing part that we would be invited into. So she's taken the most aggressive of architectural military forms and used that embrace, the obverse space that opened that space in the ground. She went on to say that the memorial is composed not as an unchanging monument, and this is really important, but as a moving composition to be understood as we move into and out of it. That is, in the traditional conception, the monument would be regarded as fixed and static, but her memorial would be defined by our movement through its space, memory by means of perambulation and walking through. You can see that one edge points toward the Washington Monument, the other one toward the Lincoln Memorial. The only human forms in this memorial is our own reflection, looking back at us with the names of the fallen soldiers, nearly 59,000, carved not alphabetically, not like a telephone book, but in the order in which they fell during the war. That is, re-embedding them in the historical memory of what happened. But in this, she basically also, created this black scar, negative form, its axes pointing toward other memorials. So it's integrated on the one hand, but it's an open space inviting us down into it and out of it. Memory by means of perambulation here, but thereby counterpointing all the traditional notions of fixed monumental memory that we've had over the ages. And in so doing, she really created a vernacular for a whole generation of German artists in particular and architects who now felt that just as Maya Lin had challenged the traditional monument in order to remember something that Americans were very ambivalent about remembering, something in fact that they almost didn't want to remember, the Germans now felt that they may have had a breakthrough in vernacular for understanding and remembering something that was also, if you will, counter to the great national, traditional heritages of national memory. So when the time came to launch an international campaign, international competition for a German national memorial to Europe's murdered Jews, they were faced with a huge, conundrum: how to remember a nation, a people murdered in the national name, how to reunite the country on the bedrock memory of a national crime. And to do this, they felt that they had to counterpoint all the traditional ways that the monument might usually remember. So Horst Hoheisel entered this competition in 1995 by proposing to blow up the Brandenburger Tor and leave behind just a gigantic void. How better to remember the destroyed Jews of Europe than by destroying the national monument, creating a space that invites people in, that this empty space, this void, will now be how we commemorate the void of the lost and murdered Jews of Europe. Of course, this design would never be accepted, but that was also part of Hoheisel's point. He wasn't sure, in fact, that there should be a single national memorial to Europe's murdered Jews. So, but conceptually, he wanted to really articulate the terrible conundrum that German artists and architects have for remembering a national crime in the national name. Another German artist, Joachim Gerz, collaborated with his wife, Esther Shalev Gerz, actually an Israeli artist, to propose this sinking monument, a vanishing monument in Harburg. This is a memorial to victims of violence and for peace, a generic Holocaust memorial. They took a 12-meter tall lead column, a lead-covered column, and then invited the citizens of Harburg and visitors to the town to add their names to ours. In doing so, we commit ourselves to remain vigilant. As more and more names cover this 12-meter tall lead column, it will gradually be lowered into the ground, and one day it will have disappeared completely, and the site of the Harburg Monument Against Fascism will be empty. In the end, it is only we ourselves who can rise up against injustice. And this line is crucial. These two artists worried that, in fact, these memorials that we're designing everywhere would somehow symbolically rise up against injustice, but actually accomplish nothing. So by creating this disappearing memorial, returning the burden of memory to the visitors who come, it reminds us that it is only we who can rise up against injustice, not our memorials at all. And this is, again, one of the big problems this generation had with memorial making, that all this memorial making somehow would become a substitute for action and not a symbolic, not just a gesture to the memory of the victims. And by the way, the Denkmal eventually, the National Memorial to Europe's Murdered Jews in Berlin, did eventually provide kind of a platform for Joschka Fischer, then foreign minister, to justify using German force to stop the Serbs from a certain genocide in Kosovo in 1999. So the local citizens went out and wrote their names very neatly on the lead column, but before long, of course, it was a scribble scrabble of graffiti, and swastikas began to appear. And when the town objected, the artist said, well, basically, isn't any memorial just a screen, reflecting back to us the things that we do with it? And it's not always pretty. In fact, they were right. And every time a 1.5 meter section was covered, it would be sunk by 1.5 meters, so that between 1986 in 1993. It was eventually sunk all the way to nothing, thereby returning the burden of memory to those who come looking for it. So we're thinking, this preoccupation with voids, absence, is now being articulated in some of these very early memorials from the 1980s, after Maya Lin proposed basically creating this void, this negative form on the Mall in Washington, D.C., inspiring a whole generation here. Jochen Gertz eventually proposed, when he was teaching in Saarbrücken at the Institute of Fine Arts, a course on memorials and monument design, he asked his class to go out and tear up cobblestones, steal cobblestones from other parts of the town, and then take cobblestones here at the Saarbrücker Schloss, which had been the Gestapo headquarters during the war, and take the stones from the square here, take them up to the classroom, and the other half of the class would carve the names of every single Jewish cemetery destroyed by the Nazis between 1933 and 1945, some 2,162 of them, and then take these stones and return them to the square, but replant them inscribed side down so that there's no visible evidence of the entire operation. When they announced what they had done, townspeople came down to find the memorial, to the 2,162 stones against racism, and of course saw nothing. And the students reminded them that they were the memorials for which they searched. The only standing form, the only vertical form on the square now would be the people who come looking for the memorial and who would now have to look within themselves. Horst Hoheisel, who in 95 had proposed the blowing up the Brandenburger Tor, had also won a competition to remember a fountain that had been destroyed by the Nazis in 1938 because the philanthropist who donated this to the town of Kassel in 1911, Zygmunt Aschrodt, was Jewish. So because of that, Nazis destroyed it. They filled it in. They called it Aschrodt's grave afterwards. He took the original form of the kind of neo-Gothic pyramid, and its fountain, and inverted it, turned it into the ground. This is the picture of his model. So that instead of restoring it, he basically built what he called a plinth for people to come and stand on and look down into the water, into the negative form below, which would now reflect, the shape and size of the original memorial. But only they would be standing in this place. Again, the burden of memory coming to those who come and contemplate the waters below. And again, these two, the disappearing memorial and this one, were designed almost at exactly the same time in 1986, but without any reference to each other. These artists didn't know what the other artists were doing, but they had all been inspired in some way by Maya Lin's 1982 design for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In Berlin, in the early 90s, also this memorial boom. A competition was called for a memorial to the book burnings, right there across from the opera, right in the middle of Berlin, Humboldt University. And this competition was won by an Israeli artist who had been living in Germany, Michael Ullmann, who proposed what he called Bibliotech. Bibliotech, as you see, there's a plaque in the foreground, and then there's a window he built right in the middle of the plaza here. The only standing forms are people coming to look at it. One plaque reads, tells the stories of the Nazi book burnings in March 1933. And the other one just quotes Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish poet, who wrote, "Where books are burned, so too one day will people be burned as well." And then you can come and look down into the window, into what the library is. And of course, this is a library devoid of all of its books. The books were destroyed, the books were burned, they can't be replaced. And what you have now is the memory of empty library shelves. The absence, the void left behind is what is being commemorated here. How to articulate that void without filling it in becomes kind of this preoccupation that this whole generation of German artists wanted to somehow formalize. They did not want to compensate this loss with beauty, with meaning that would in any way justify the mass murder of Jews. We would now contemplate loss with loss, remember loss with loss, remember the void left behind with the articulation of further voids. This is another memorial for Vienna called Bibliotech by Rachel Whiteread, whose specialty was articulating absence in space with material, giving absence materiality, in her words, or materiality becoming an index of absence, as she called it. She was famous in 1984 and won the Turner Prize for Art and Sculpture by filling a row house with concrete and then taking away all the forms and all the walls, leaving behind only the now articulated empty space of this row house. So she proposed taking the space between the leaves of a book in a library and articulating only that space between the leaves and the wall, kind of taking that space in the library and turning it inside out. And there's an entire story, which I tell at much greater length than At Memory's Edge. But it was built finally. And again, around this bookish theme of absence and materiality as an index of absence, how to remember the people of the book through the figure of the library, but also through the figure of space, the space between the books in the library and the wall. Remembering a void with a void. Shimon Ati, an American artist who went to Berlin to spend the year in 1992, just after the wall, not long after the wall came down, looked around and was struck by what he didn't see. Any sign of the, what had been the kind of the Ostjuden, or the Eastern Jews who had lived in the middle of Berlin, Mitte, in the Schöneviertel, or the kind of the so-called barn district of Berlin. And so he did some research and he found hundreds of photographs of Jews, mostly Polish Jews, stateless Jews, who were living in this neighborhood, and projected them back onto the sites to remind these sites of what was missing. So there's a Jewish bookstore on this former site. And of course, the effect's quite uncanny. It's as if you were peeling off a layer of history and finding what was lying beneath it, like a palimpsest. A Jewish bakery, a Jewish theater. And again, would project what's in his mind's eye onto these sites, hoping that once passersby had seen this, even when you turned the installation off, these projections of photographs on their original sites, the mind's eye would continue to see it. That the burden of memory is on those who come and need to remember what was here, projecting back onto these walls what they know. So the very first competition was voided. The competition that Horst Weisel had submitted his, blowing up the Brandenburger Tor to. And a new competition was called in 1997, and I was appointed as one of 5 jurors to this new competition, only because I had spoken at a series of symposia there in Berlin to try to understand why it was so difficult for Germany to arrive at a national Holocaust memorial. And I had told them, in fact, that I wasn't so sure there should be a central national memorial, that Germany had dozens of excellent, smaller museums, concentration camps, hundreds of in-site memorials for points of deportation and destroyed synagogues and lost families. But eventually they said, well, because we're not sure, you're not sure we can do it, that's why we want you to help us try. And I said, I will join the jury, but only if we can ask a question and see if artists are able to articulate the question and not find an answer. After the Holocaust, no more final solutions to this terrible conundrum in Germany, how to remember people murdered in the national name. This design by Daniel Liebeskind, also it looks like broken pieces of the wall. But what we liked very much the way he allowed the site to run over into the Tiergarten. You've got the Reichstag up on the left, Potsdamer Platz, behind the photographer here. He was interested in these voids and how to articulate the voids and the breaches, again, without filling them in. That was our third choice. Our second choice was this design by Gesine Weinmiller. Again, you can see the inspiration, Maya Lin's inspiration here, that she recesses this so that as you walk down into this space, parts of the city will disappear. She took 18 segments of limestone wall to echo the Kotel, or the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and seemed to arrange them randomly. What we found is we walked around the parapet here, and we got to this corner on the right, that these seemingly randomly arranged segments of limestone wall actually began to congeal and to form a kind of a broken star of David. And then as we continued walking, that star would fall apart a little bit and decompose. We worried that it might be a little gimmicky, but we found this ourselves. And she said, everybody might find what they will find here. But we liked this a lot. And then we put basically this one up against the design by Peter Eisenman and then Richard Serra. Eisenman, a great American architect, Richard Serra, a great American sculptor, who had teamed up to propose 4,200 Stele, but ranging in height from ground level to almost 30 feet high. We thought it was too gargantuan. It would cover the entire 5-acre plot of the proposed site of the ministerial gardens in the middle of Berlin. And we also thought it was dangerous. We could imagine, kids running out over the tops, but falling 30 feet. And we appreciated that the artist, in particular, Richard Serra, wanted this to be ominous and even figuratively dangerous, but to our minds, it could be literally dangerous. And we wanted to back off its literal danger, even as it might threaten kind of the peace of mind of the visitors who came in to visit. This was the site before it was being built. We ended up choosing the Eisenman design, but only with changes. We scaled down from 4,200 Stele to 1,711. We asked them to reduce the size, which Peter Eisenman did gladly. Richard Serra did not want to do that. He said, if you change the size of these, then it no longer has the danger and the kind of the monumental logic that I wanted to have. And so he left the project, leaving it for Eisenman. And so this is now just called the Eisenman #2 design, which it became a political football. It became a protracted debate, long discussion, very difficult, but eventually was approved by the parliament. I tell the long version of the story in both the stages of memory and at Memory's Edge. And it was built. And what you'll see here, of course, is these stela anchored in the ground. In a few minutes, you're going to see that this was, in fact, an inspiring kind of design for the Mass Design Group and the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, who were able to kind of be inspired by the stela and then go into take it to the next realm at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. Another really interesting part of this memorial, of course, is it's completely abstract. There's no clear reference to mass murder, except insofar as this could become a bit of a symbolic cemetery. Each of these stelae is just a little bit off plumb, about 3 degrees off plumb. Everybody has to find their own way in and through them. And the question is a legitimate one. How does this abstract design, in fact, get anchored in historical memory? And part of our recommendation was to include this site a place of information, or what amounts to a small museum, which was designed by Dagmar von Wilken in kind of a brilliant move. Underneath this sea, this forest of stelae, you can descend. Sorry. And find the illusion of the stelae sinking down into the ground, so that the abstract memory above is now anchored in the very hard historical narrative on the walls below. But it's like a yin and yang, in which there's this interpenetration of stelae design above and now being supported, grounded in a foundation of hard historical narrative below, something which did inspire us in New York City, where we had this, of course, these 2 gigantic voids, which are now anchored in an excellent memorial, a museum for 9/11, which tells the story of that day in extraordinary detail. But we've got the abstract design above, now anchored in hard history below. And again, that's part of this memorial arc of memorial vernacular, the way that each of these in some ways will inform and inspire designs that come after. And here, of course, the children do run out over the tops. This is another project that I want to, the Stolpersteiner, the Stumbling Stones by Gunther Demnig, who plants these brass stones, brass plaques, instead of cobblestones, at the homes of Jews who had been deported from these very homes. This is in Hamburg. And then another project which portends, I think, the direction of memorial design in general, just as we have the design in New York City of the voids and trees, life remembered with life, the voids remembering loss with loss. Horst Hoheisel and his artistic partner, Andreas Knitz, won a competition to commemorate a destroyed synagogue in Eberswalden, formerly East Germany, a synagogue which had been burned down by the townspeople on Kristallnacht in 1938. The night of broken glass, when hundreds of synagogues, in fact, were destroyed, and thousands of Jews and Jewish businesses were also destroyed. They decided to excavate the site, onto which there had actually been a police station built, and found the retaining walls for the synagogue. They proposed then to build a 3 meter, about a 10-foot tall wall describing Kristallnacht, the burning of the synagogue in Eberswald, November 9th, 1938. and using the foundations of the synagogue walls as a foundation now for a solid wall where there's no point of entry. So it would be a void inside where there had once been life. And Horst Hoheisel, the artist, also has a PhD in forestry. He knew that life would take hold all by itself with blown seeds, birds, other kinds of life, planting all kinds of brush and trees inside here, so that little by little, this void would be filled with life. You remember the life of the synagogue now with the life of trees. And this is part of a trend toward what I would call, I guess, the memorial, the greening of memorial design. And this echoes, once again, the use of trees as a crucial part of the memorial in New York City for the 9/11 design. And finally, we come back and I think probably that this memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, it's conceived and built by the Equal Justice Initiative. Brian Stevenson, of course, is the initiator of the Equal Justice Initiative to tell the story of unequal justice after slavery, of course, and to create a lynching memorial, which would describe, in fact, all the victims of racial terror in this country, what we would otherwise refer to as America's original sin. And in conjunction with the Mass Design Group based out of Boston, Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative proposed taking almost 800 stelae, 6-foot Corten steel stelae, one for each county where a lynching occurred, and covering these with the names of the victims, lynching victims. But instead of planting them in the ground, of course, these kind of humanly proportioned stelae are hanging from the ceilings. It's completely haunting. It's devastating, in fact, to visit. And they've also created a way in which they've duplicated every single one of these hanging stelae, and they are stacked just outside, and invite every single county named on the edges of these stelae to come and claim its own and take it back to the county as a memorial, where they would again plant it somehow in the ground or mount it or even hang it from a tree, however they want to bring it back to commemorate the victims of lynching in any particular county. So these now become very much places where it's memory by means of perambulation. You walk in. As you walk in here, of course, the ground descends, and where you are coming face to face, you eventually walk underneath them so that they're all hanging above you. And then they become kind of mobile memorials, insofar as the duplicated stelae stacked outside will be moved to the sites of the original lynchings by the counties who come claim them, again demanding that these counties come and reclaim the history and the memory that they have so far only forgotten. So this question that came up at the very beginning, how to remember absence with absence, how to create memorials without compensating such terrible loss or redeeming such terrible loss with beauty, became a mutual preoccupation between, I'd say, the artist and architect Maya Lin and this whole generation of artists in Germany. Came back to inspire Michael Arad and Peter Walker in New York City, and eventually would inspire Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. That memory, in fact, can come without redemption, and must come with instruction and a way to own that memory again. So this is kind of this trajectory of counter monuments, and it'll be very interesting to see what we have coming in the next 5 or 10 years, especially when we begin commemorating the victims of the current pandemic. So with that, I'll stop and open up for questions, and really appreciate everybody paying attention. I hope everybody can see everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wish that we could do a big round of applause with all of the audience. A very interesting talk. Let's see. First off, I'd like to remind people to type questions into the chat. We already have some up. I think our first one is from Karen Markin. Let's see. How do we reconcile the existence of these Holocaust memorials with current Holocaust denial efforts?
Actually, I don't think you can reconcile these Holocaust memorials with Holocaust denial. But it's also true that some of the early Holocaust memorials and museums were attempts to address Holocaust denialism. But it soon became, everybody became excruciatingly aware that, in fact, you can't prove these events to Holocaust deniers, or any more than you could, prove slavery to those who deny that slavery was bad or even took place at all. That you can't really engage denialists, but you need to commemorate events by anchoring them in history, and not attempt actually to answer denialists. Denialism has become, a real social and political disease in this country. Whether it's denying climate change, or denying the Holocaust, or denying the seriousness of COVID, or denying science, it's actually really pulled the rug out from underneath. Very solid policy. How to be inspired by historical events, and rather than being in a position somehow to deny them. It's a tough question. Thanks for asking.
Let's see. What's our next question? This is from Garrett Wilson. Of the memorials you've consulted on or studied, which process was the most controversial, and why?
Probably the German Denkmal. Was, and maybe still is, the most controversial. I have a feeling that still only about half the German population has really embraced the Denkmal, because it actually embodies, again, that almost impossible to answer question. Countries never build their memorial heritages on the memory of crimes committed in the national name. Countries build, our national malls on the memory of victimization, the memory of our own martyrdom, the memory of our victories, but never on the memory of our crimes. And in this strange way, Germany, by really addressing openly and transparently and painfully what it means to build a national legacy on the memory of a national, crime, a genocide committed in the national name, has taught America something. I mean, in this weird way, it was American Jim Crow laws which actually instructed Hitler when he went about, forming their Nuremberg laws. And in this weird way, Germany, in its ongoing attempt to commemorate, the Jews murdered in the German national name, have begun to instruct Americans a little bit about what it means to re-own a part of the American past. 400 years of slavery, and make that a central building block of America.
Let's see, what's next? All right, this is from Shaban Richards. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. What is your position on current controversies over removing statues of historical figures such as Columbus or Confederate generals?
I think part of the life of any memorial is how it's received in any given generation. The Confederate memorials in particular were clearly conceived not just to commemorate Confederate, so-called Confederate heroes, but they were really proposed some 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years after the Civil War to honor the lost cause, and they were built mostly by, again, white supremacists, apologists for the Confederacy, to kind of to throw it in the face of the civil rights movement. So I have no problem with removal of these Confederate memorials. I think that's actually the course of a memorial's life will almost always include its destruction. I hate to say it, but all kinds of memorials will also basically last about as long as a human life. They're born, they live around 70 years, and then they're often replaced or filled in. We will see what happens with all the memorials I've just shown you. So I probably have a little bit more of a problem. I worry that in getting rid, for example, of all the Columbus memorials, that it ends up becoming a little bit of a whitewashing of history. That these memorials need to be recontextualized. Columbus needs to be recontextualized, as the beginning of colonization of North America, by Europeans, and everything that happened after this. So it's a way of restoring. I think even the Confederate memorials that are getting taken down end up needing to be replaced in some way with the context of why they were built, who built them, what they mean now, and what it means now to be recontextualized, perhaps in a museum of torn down Confederate monuments, and why a generation no longer wants these memorials, in their midst. So if you can open up the stories of all these memorials to include, their genesis, their lives, their reception, and their eventual destruction, then I think that we've kind of opened up the study of memory as an active, ongoing site in its longue durée, which is, I think, the way to see all these memorials.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, let's see. Our next question is from Jenna Panis. Again, I apologize if I mispronounce names. When thinking about this kind of commemorative architecture, are the environmental impacts considered?
They are, especially, I think, kind of a generation now very much preoccupied with environmental, protecting the environment, tending now to use living forms to commemorate life lost, so that life would be remembered with life, and lives wouldn't be remembered only by the moment of their destruction. And that's a major change in commemorative statuary, commemorative design, even in the sense that Maya Lin wanted to create, if you will, that wound in the landscape, but a wound which we walk into and walk out of, so that it becomes kind of an ongoing process, that memory by means of perambulation, and again, remembers the void, even as it looks to have regenerating life, kind of attempting to mend it at the same time. So they do, especially these gigantic projects, almost all gigantic national projects at this point have to take into account environment around them. In the case of the 9/11 memorial, it was clearly repairing the city, stitching memory back into its national context here, back into the grid of the streets, which is a really, really important part. And that's why Peter Walker's design of the trees was just so genius. The trees were added here again to create shade, to create a place for repose and a respite, from the heat, in the sun during the summer, but also as a way to remind everybody of the city grid, so that when you look at these let's see if I go back up here. You can see this drawing. When you look from east to west, you can see the trees in very straight rows, just like the streets, the city streets in New York. But when you look from north to south, you see these kind of random, like random groves of trees. It's called the abacus grid approach to planting, these trees, so that you both, if you will, restore kind of a natural grove of trees to this place downtown, even as you restore this site to the grid of streets and cross streets going from east to west. And it was really that genius that won us all over, in combination with the Michael Arad design of the two voids, with further voids at their centers.
Okay. All right, let's see. Our next question is from Lisa Tom. Speaking about the difficulties of politics, what do you think of criticisms that the neutrality of these memorials and monuments have led to dissociation and desensitization?
I think there are memorials which have attempted to remain neutral, which did not want to be inoffensive. But the new generation, I'd say from Maya Lin on, these generations are not interested actually in going along and getting along, but they want to provoke people both into being changed inwardly by memory, for example, of the fallen of the Vietnam War, American fallen of the Vietnam War. It was meant to be a wound that would constantly be healing, but might never heal completely. The provocative, disappearing monuments and negative form monuments in Germany are the same thing. They're meant actually to create stumbling stones, as Debnig's Stolpersteine would, that you would have to trip over them. That they come up and surprise you in some ways, and surprise you with memory that maybe you've been trying to avoid all this time. So that's, I think, why we've trended away, from the very traditional, generals, on the horse and these figurative designs, which in some ways do desensitize us to history. We're meant to be now moved by it and provoked by it, and provoked by memory. Memory should not be just a pleasure and a way to repair, but memory might also be kind of a tearing of the veil that remains torn. So that something inside us has changed, and that we're not the same once we've remembered, whether the Holocaust or slavery or lynching, or any great terrible destruction like the 9/11 attacks.
Great. I'd like to remind people, please, if you have questions, just type them into the chat. We're very interested in getting your questions. Let's see, what is our next question? This is from Addison Hurwitz. What are some of the projects and memorials you're working on now?
So there's a handful. I was invited by the Norwegian government to come help them figure out how to commemorate the July 22nd, 2011 attacks by a white nationalist who murdered 69 labor youth summer campers on the little island of Utøya outside of Oslo, and who blew up the government center, killing 8 people and injuring another couple hundred. 77 people murdered overall. So I worked very closely with the Labor Party and the Youth Labor Group to figure out how to remember these events on Utøya without this memory somehow displacing all the great memories from 50 years of leadership campers, on this island in the past. So we found a way to retain about half of the cafe building where 12 of the kids were shot, taking away a part of it, but then restoring part of it, and having remember both life with life in this case, but also the loss and destruction of these kids, um, with voids, within this island.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been working closely with them on that, and they're about to unveil a national memorial just off of the island, where the ferry left, and actually where the ferry took the killer out there, pretending to be a state policeman there to secure the island after the bombing of the government center. I'm also on a jury based in Budapest to commemorate women victims of sexual violence and mass rape during times of war. It's a very unusual project. I'm still not clear exactly how it came to be that the municipality of Budapest and the museum in Budapest wanted to make this their own. But it is going, and we've actually chosen a winning design, which will in time be announced. Part of the inspiration for this memorial was the memorial in Pristina, Kosovo. The only memorial in Pristina commemorating the victims of the Serb, the attempted genocide by Serbs of the Kosovar Albanians in 1999. There's a memorial of President Clinton on the one hand, who formed a data response or Stop the Serbs. But the only other set of victims, remember, are the women victims of rape, mass rape, and sexual assault by the Serb soldiers as they pushed this almost 1 million Kosovar Albanians into a corner of Kosovo where they were going to be murdered. And in doing so, they created a figure by which all the victims of this averted genocide would now be understood through the trope of women victims of rape. And the very last elections in Kosovo, just about 8 months ago, the entire slate of the winning parliamentarians and the new prime minister are all women, and many of them were actually victims of sexual assault during the siege by the Serbs. So the possibilities for remembering the victims of war through the prism of women victims of sexual violence are very, very intriguing here. We'll see what happens finally. I'm finally also working with Daniel Liebeskind on the Tree of Life Memorial and Education Center in Pittsburgh for the mass murder committed by again another white nationalist terrorist a few years ago. So that's in play. We're still working on that. I mean, I'm glad to help anywhere I can. I'm very non-prescriptive. Sometimes I'm invited to come help, and they say, "Okay, just tell us what to do," as they did in Norway. And I said, "I didn't come here to tell you what to do. I came here to keep you company as we figure this out together." So just to keep that space open and understand that it's a process, that it takes time. Sometimes it takes much more time than we think it should, but we just have to take the time that we need to work through this memorial process, and ask very clear questions as to why we want to commemorate these events, in what form we want to commemorate them, whom are we remembering, and why. And keep all of these questions, right in front of us as we proceed.
Okay, let's see. Our next question is from Kathleen McIntyre. Have you followed similar debates over detention centers in Chile or Argentina, whether to demolish or preserve as a public memorial to those murdered or disappeared during La Guerra Sucias?
The desaparecidos were only to be remembered. I know when the junta was out of office, and they began with the mothers, of course, of the victims, remembering, creating a spontaneous memorial. And then eventually, the Argentinian government did arrive at several memorial designs and memorial projects along the river. the plateau where many of the murdered, mostly young kids, high school and college kids, have been dropped out of helicopters and things into the river. So at the beginning of these projects, the initiators just have to be very clear in their own minds toward what ends are they remembering, and why are they remembering? Are they remembering as a way to put a kind of a sense of closure to these events, so they won't be haunted by them anymore, and maybe that would lead them to destroy some of these detention centers or some of the prisons where these things happen? Or do you actually use these sites to tell the stories of what happened here, as painful as they may be, and again, and make them inviting enough so that people will come and understand themselves, and even better in light of this, these remembered atrocities. And again, it's very difficult for governments sometimes to tell these stories, back to themselves. I'd say the more authoritarian the government is, the less likely that these things are going to be recalled. In the sense of Russia right now, they just shut down their national project called Memorial,
Yes.
which commemorated the crimes, of course, of the this kind of the Stalin era, and the NKVD and their crimes, because it becomes very inconvenient to remember the crimes of the regime, when in some ways, as Putin would like to do, is to kind of resurrect a little bit of that, that Soviet authoritarian dictatorship. It's very difficult to do when you remember the crimes committed, in their name. So they tend to go away. So the more authoritarian the regime, the less likely, a national legacy is going to include, these kinds of calamities.
I think we have time for one more question. Though we'll probably have to wrap it up pretty quickly. Karen Markin, would you say there's a trend toward memorials that are experienced instead of merely observed, as with the representational statues of past years?
Definitely. Absolutely. I think the memorial artists are much more interested now in the visceral experience their spaces generate in visitors, and that they want their visitors not to come and be passive observers. They don't want visitors to come in and feel dominated by a gigantic, overweening monument telling you what to think, but they want visitors to come in and be changed inwardly by their memorial experience, and to exit now rededicated somehow to making sure that these horrible events aren't repeated. So I say that the most important thing for this new generation of artists and architects in particular is trying to figure out how to change the visitors inwardly during these visits, so that they are in fact shaped inside by the memory, being generated and being promoted in these sites. So it's a great point, and a great point maybe to end on. That no longer are these memorials supposed to be just telling us what to think. No longer are we just supposed to be passive bystanders, observing them, but we need to be acting, in dialogue with them, moving through these sites, changing ourselves inwardly in order to maybe to change things around us, for the better.
Okay. Great. Well, sadly, we're out of time. Wonderful answer. I'd like to thank Professor Young for a very stimulating and interesting talk. I'd also like to thank the audience for their attention and for the very penetrating questions. Now, we also have a few co-sponsors to thank, the URI College of Arts and Sciences and the URI Department of History. I'd also like to remind the audience that our series will resume on the 3rd of March with a panel on the legacy of slavery in Rhode Island. Please visit uri.edu/humanities/events/ to learn more about this and other upcoming events. And with that, I will bid you a safe night.